They called him a broken alpha, a leader who couldn't see, couldn't hunt, couldn't rule. So they stopped whispering behind his back and started plotting right in front of him. But what they didn't understand was that losing his sight didn't make him weak. It made him dangerous. Because while they relied on their eyes, he learned to hear every lie, to feel every shift in power, to smell every betrayal. And when they sent a scent guide to control him, a rebellious, out-of-line girl meant to keep him in line, they made a fatal mistake. Because the woman who stepped into his territory was no servant, no healer, no pawn. She was a rebel, a weapon, and the one person in the world who was supposed to destroy him. But the moment she got close enough, his wolf recognized her, not as an enemy, not as a threat, but as something far more dangerous, his fated mate. And now, the alpha who cannot see must decide whether to trust the one woman sent to betray him or watch his entire pack burn from the inside out. The silver goblet hit the stone floor with a hollow, mocking clang. Red wine bloomed across the dais like a fresh throat wound, splashing the hem of the alpha's white robes. "Oops," sneered Malphus, a scarred lead enforcer whose scent reeked of stale tobacco and fermented ambition. "My apologies, Alpha. I forgot you couldn't see the table's edge, or my hand, or the look of pity on every face in this hall." A suffocating silence descended over the great hall of the Obsidian Peak. 300 wolves sat at the long trestle tables, their breathing synchronized in a rhythmic, predatory thrum. Usually, such disrespect toward an alpha would result in a dislocated jaw, but today the pack didn't growl, they watched. Cyprian, the blind king of the north, didn't flinch. He sat perfectly still, his eyes covered by a wrap of reinforced black silk. To the uninitiated, he looked like a martyr awaiting execution. To those who knew better, he looked like a tripwire. "The wine is a 2014 vintage from the southern slopes," Cyprian said, his voice a calm, low-frequency vibration that seemed to settle in the marrow of everyone's bones. "Bittersweet, much like your loyalty, Malphus. You didn't drop it. You tipped your wrist 15 degrees to the left. Your heart rate spiked to 110 beats per minute the moment the metal hit the floor. You're performing." Malphus stiffened, his sneer faltering. He looked around at the tiered rows of warriors. "A pack needs a predator who can see the border, not a monk who reads heartbeats like a tavern poet. The Silverclaw pack is encroaching on the western ridge. They've scented our weakness. They know our alpha is a statue in a dark room." A murmur of jagged agreement rippled through the hall. It was the sound of a landslide starting, small pebbles at first, then the weight of the mountain. "He's right," a voice called from the back. "How can you lead a hunt you can't see?" "Enough!" The elder, Vane, stood up, his white hair gleaming under the iron chandeliers. "Cyprian's bloodline is the bedrock of this peak, but the pack's concerns are not unfounded. Safety is paramount." Vane turned toward the throne, his scent shifting to something oily and manipulative, the smell of a compromise that felt more like a cage. "Alpha, the council has decided. Since you refuse to step down, we are bringing in a scent guide, a specialized scout to be your literal eyes. She will be tethered to you. She will direct your blade in battle. She will be your shadow." Cyprian's jaw tightened, the only sign of his rising fury. "I am not a dog to be walked on a leash, Vane. My senses provide a map of this world more accurate than your failing sight. I can hear the condensation forming on the windows of the 3rd floor down. I do not need a guide." "It is not a request," Malphus barked, emboldened by the elder's support. "It is a requirement of your continued rule. Without a guide, the pack will call for a rite of severance by dawn." The rite. A ritualistic execution where the pack tore an unfit alpha apart. Cyprian's hand gripped the arm of his slate throne. The stone cracked under his fingers, a spiderweb of fractures appearing in the solid rock. The threat was clear: accept a handler or face a coup. The tension was thick enough to choke on when the air in the hall suddenly changed. The wind shifted outside, pushing through the high, narrow ventilation slits. Cyprian's nostrils flared. He didn't smell the pine or the snow. He smelled ozone. "Get down," Cyprian said, his voice dropping an octave into a guttural command. "Don't ignore us, Alpha." Malphus stepped forward, reaching for Cyprian's shoulder to spin him around. "Look at me when—" "Get down!" Cyprian's hand shot out with the speed of a viper. He didn't grab Malphus. He grabbed the heavy oak chair Malphus had been sitting in and hurled it toward the high gallery. Whoomp! The chair collided with a cloaked figure perched in the rafters, just as the sharp twang of a high-tension crossbow string echoed through the hall. The bolt, coated in a shimmering, iridescent toxin, liquid silver, streaked through the air where Cyprian's head had been a millisecond before. It buried itself in the back of the throne with a hiss, the stones sizzling as the acid-tipped metal ate into the rock. The hall erupted. Warriors drew blades. Women and children scrambled for the exits. "Assassin!" Vane shrieked. Cyprian didn't wait for the guards. He stepped off the dais, not with the hesitant steps of a blind man, but with the terrifying precision of a machine. He didn't need eyes. He had the room's acoustics. He heard the assassin's boots scrape against the wooden beam 30 feet above. He heard the click of a second bolt being loaded. "Malphus, to the left," Cyprian commanded. Malphus, frozen in shock, didn't move. Cyprian cursed, lunging forward. He kicked a heavy serving platter off a nearby table, sending it spinning into the air like a silver shield. The second bolt hit the platter with a deafening ping, ricocheting into the ceiling. Cyprian closed his eyes, though it made no difference, and centered his world on the sound of the assassin's breath. Ragged, panicked, smelling of bitter almonds. He snatched a steak knife from a table, balanced the weight for a heartbeat, and flicked his wrist. The knife whistled through the air, cutting through the smoke of the torches. A choked scream followed. A body tumbled from the rafters, crashing onto a table with a splintering wreck of wood and bone. The assassin was dead before his head hit the floor. Cyprian stood in the center of the hall, his chest rising and falling slowly. The white robes were stained with wine, but his posture was that of a god. He turned his blindfolded head toward Malphus. "He was standing in your blind spot, Malphus," Cyprian said coldly. "Perhaps you are the one who needs a guide." The enforcer went pale, backing away as the pack looked from the dead assassin to their alpha in stunned, shamed silence. The demonstration of power was undeniable, but the fear remained. The assassin had come too close. The pack was vulnerable. Elder Vane stepped over the rubble, his face set in grim lines. "A parlor trick won't stop a coordinated strike, Cyprian. The Silver Claws are sending more than one man next time. The council's decision stands. Your guide arrives tonight." Cyprian's lip curled. "Who is she? Which spineless lapdog have you chosen to spy on me?" Vane hesitated, a flicker of genuine apprehension crossing his face. "She's no lapdog. We had to go outside the pack. We had to find someone whose scent work is legendary, but whose record is complicated." "A name, Vane," Cyprian growled. "Nyra Vane," the elder whispered. The room went ice cold. Even the enforcers looked uneasy. Nyra Vane, the she-wolf of the scrapyard, a rebel who had been exiled 3 years ago for nearly disemboweling the Alpha of the South. She was known for 2 things, an olfactory sense that could track a drop of blood through a hurricane, and a violent, pathological hatred for Alpha authority. "You're bringing a criminal into my house?" Cyprian's voice was a low snarl. "You're bringing a specialist," Vane countered, "and she's already at the gates." The massive iron-bound doors at the end of the hall began to groan open. The freezing mountain wind surged in, extinguishing half the torches and plunging the room into a flickering amber twilight. Cyprian stood his ground, his heightened senses suddenly overwhelmed. Usually he could categorize a person instantly, but the scent wafting off the figure walking down the center aisle was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It wasn't just rain or fur or sweat. It was gunpowder, crushed jasmine, and raw, unfiltered lightning. But there was something else. Underneath the scent of a warrior lay a frequency in the air that made the wolf inside Cyprian's chest, the beast that had been dormant and cold for years, suddenly slam against his ribs with a violent, possessive roar. The figure stopped 10 feet away. The clink of heavy combat boots echoed through the hall. "I was told," a raspy, defiant female voice rang out, "I would be leashed to a broken king." Nyra stepped into the light of the remaining torches. She was covered in leather and scars, her hair a messy shock of dark curls, her eyes glowing with a dangerous amber fire. She looked at the blindfolded Alpha not with pity, but with a challenge that bordered on an invitation to war. "You don't look broken to me," she said, her voice dropping to a provocative purr. "You just look lonely." Cyprian felt a phantom ache in his chest, a snap of a bond he didn't want and couldn't ignore. His superpower senses were screaming at him, telling him that the woman standing before him wasn't just his guide, she was his fated mate, and she was holding a silver dagger behind her back. Cyprian took a step forward, his voice a dangerous velvet. "Nyra Vane, you have 10 seconds to drop that blade, or this broken king will show you exactly how I hunt in the dark." Nyra didn't drop the knife. She smiled, and the scent of lightning intensified. "Make me, Alpha." Outside, the first howl of the Silver Claw war party echoed from the ridge, but inside the hall, the real war had just begun.
The silence in the Alpha's private war room was heavy, pressurized by the scent of old parchment and the ionized tang of the incoming storm. Cyprian stood by the narrow slit of a window, his back to Nyra. The silk blindfold was tight, a physical barrier between him and a world he navigated through a symphony of vibrations. Nyra sat on the edge of a heavy mahogany table, cleaning the dried blood of the assassin from her fingernails with the tip of her silver dagger. She watched him, the way his shoulders didn't just sit, but seemed to anchor the entire room. "You're staring," Cyprian said. Nyra didn't flinch. "I'm studying. If I'm supposed to be your eyes in the next skirmish, I need to know your tells. You favor your right side when you pivot. Your breathing hitches when the wind shifts from the north. You're wound tighter than a crossbow string, Alpha." "It's Cyprian, and my tells are none of your concern as long as the Silver Claws are kept at bay." "Everything about you is my concern now," she snapped, hopping off the table. The combat boots hit the floor with a decisive thud. She walked toward him, her scent, that volatile mix of jasmine and gunpowder, billowing forward like a physical wave. That's what the council paid for, a shadow, a leash. She stopped 3 inches from his back. She meant to provoke him, to see the legendary Alpha composure crack. Then it happened. It wasn't a slow realization, it was an explosion. A golden primordial tether snapped into existence, hooking into Cyprian's sternum and yanking his soul toward hers. The air in his lungs turned to liquid lead. His heart, usually a steady, rhythmic drum, bucked against his ribs like a trapped animal. Mate. The word didn't come from his mind, it roared from the prehistoric depths of his wolf. The beast, usually a cold, calculating partner in his darkness, suddenly surged forward, demanding he turn, demanding he claim, demanding he mark. Cyprian gasped, his hand flying to the stone windowsill to steady himself. The stone groaned and pulverized under his grip. "Cyprian?" Nyra's voice changed. The defiance was gone, replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of breath. She felt it too. The bond slammed into her like a physical blow to the stomach. Her vision blurred, the edges of the room glowing with an unnatural amber hue. Her skin tingled where his shadow fell over her. every instinct she'd spent a decade honing, the instinct to run, to bite, to never let an alpha near her throat, was being systematically dismantled by a chemical command her DNA couldn't ignore. "I won't let it," she hissed, more to herself than him. "I didn't survive the scrapyards to become a biological accessory to a throne." Cyprian turned slowly. His blindfold was slightly askew from his sudden movement. He couldn't see the tears of fury shimmering in his eyes, but he could hear the frantic, panicked fluttering of her heart. It sounded like a bird hitting a window pane. "You're thinking I want this?" Cyprian's voice was dangerously low, vibrating with the effort of not lunging across the small gap between them. "I have a pack to lead. I have a war to win. I do not have room for the distraction of a fated mate, especially one who wants to put a knife in my ribs." "Then fight it." Nyra stepped closer, her anger overriding her fear. She grabbed the lapels of his white robe, her knuckles white. "Fight the instinct, King. Prove you're as strong as everyone says. Reject me." The scent of her, close, heated, and desperate, was a tactical nuke to his self-control. Cyprian's hand shot out, grabbing her waist and pulling her flush against him. The contact was electric. A literal spark jumped between them, the smell of ozone turning into the scent of burning wood. "I can't reject what is already woven into my marrow," he whispered, his face inches from hers. He could feel the heat of her breath. "You're trembling," she breathed. "And you're crying." They stood there, two predators locked in a stalemate of biology and trauma. The bond was a bridge of light in a room full of shadows, forcing two souls who hated everything the other represented to acknowledge a truth neither was ready for.
A sharp rap on the door shattered the moment. Nyra shoved herself away from him, nearly tripping over a chair. She frantically wiped her face, her chest heaving. Cyprian turned back to the window, his posture instantly shifting back to the regal, untouchable alpha, though his hands remained clenched into bloodless fists. "Enter," Cyprian commanded. Malphus stepped in, his eyes darting between the two of them. He was a hunter. He knew the smell of pheromones and high-stakes tension. He caught the scent of the bond, that unmistakable sweet musk of a mated pair, and his eyes narrowed into slits of pure, calculated malice. "The Border Patrol caught a scout, Alpha," Malphus said, his voice dripping with false deference. "But that's not why I'm here. Elder Vane is asking why the scent guide hasn't been fitted with the link collar yet. If she's to be your eyes, she needs to be synchronized." "The collar is unnecessary," Cyprian said. Malphus raised an eyebrow. "Unnecessary? Or is the alpha becoming sentimental? You've spent 10 minutes in a room with a traitorous exile, and already you're changing pack law. The men are talking, Cyprian. They say you're not just blind, you're soft." Nyra saw the muscle in Cyprian's jaw twitch. She expected him to roar, to throw Malphus through the wall. Instead, he did something that shocked her. "Nyra," Cyprian said, his voice calm, "check the scout. Malphus says he's a Silverclaw. Tell me if he's lying." Nyra blinked. "You're asking for my input? In front of him?" "I'm trusting your nose," Cyprian said, his sightless gaze directed at Malphus, since the enforcers seemed to have lost their ability to vet a threat. Nyra felt a strange, unwelcome surge of pride. For the first time in her life, an alpha wasn't commanding her, he was delegating power. She looked at Malphus, who was simmering with quiet rage. "Fine," Nyra said, walking past Malphus. She deliberately brushed his shoulder, smelling the sour metallic scent of a man who was hiding a secret weapon. "But if I find out your scout is just a distraction for something else, Malphus, I'm taking your ear as a trophy." She walked out of the room, her heart still racing from the bond, but her mind sharpening for the hunt. Inside the room, Malphus waited until her footsteps faded. "You're making a mistake, Cyprian," Malphus hissed. "She'll be the death of you." "Get out, Malphus." The enforcer bowed low, a mocking gesture. He turned and left, but he didn't head toward the dungeons. He slipped into a side corridor where Elder Vane was waiting in the shadows. "Did you smell it?" Vane whispered. Malphus grinned, a jagged, ugly thing. Clear as day. The blind king has found his queen, and she's the most hated woman in the north. Vane nodded, his eyes cold. Good. A man who won't step down for the good of the pack must be pulled down by his heartstrings. If we can't kill him with silver, we'll kill him with her. Inform the Silver Claw contact. We don't just want a raid anymore, we want a kidnapping. And the Burl? If she survives the extraction, she's yours to do with as you wish, Vane said dismissively. But once she's gone, and Cyprian loses his mate, his wolf will go feral. He'll break the law, he'll slaughter his own men in a grief rage, and the pack will have no choice but to execute him. In the war room, Cyprian stood alone, his hand trembling as he reached up to touch the silk blindfold. He could still smell her. He could still feel the golden tether pulling at his heart. He didn't know the trap was closing. He only knew that for the first time in 10 years, he was afraid of the dark.
The council chamber of the Obsidian Peak was a circular pit of cold basalt, designed so that every whisper echoed like a shout. At the center stood Cyprian, his white robes now replaced by charcoal-gray combat leathers. Beside him, Nyra felt like a live wire stripped of its insulation. The smell in the room was rancid. It was the scent of 40 high-ranking wolves, men and women who had tasted power and found the current alpha's infirmity a convenient excuse to crave more. The border has been breached 3 times in 48 hours, Elder Vane announced, his voice smooth as polished bone. He stood on the upper tier looking down at them. And each time our blind king was tucked away in his chambers with an exile, a woman who, I might remind the council, was banished for drawing alpha blood. I wasn't tucked away, Cyprian said, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a guillotine. I was mapping the Silver Claw's advancement patterns. They aren't raiding for food, they're testing our response times. They're looking for a gap in the perimeter that doesn't exist. Or perhaps, Malphus interjected, stepping from the shadows of a pillar. They're waiting for their inside contact to give the signal. He pointed a jagged finger at Nyra. She was found at the western ridge an hour before the last skirmish, Malphus lied, his scent a foul cocktail of triumph and deceit. What were you doing there, Nyra? Scouting for the pack or marking the path for our enemies? Nyra felt the predatory gaze of 40 wolves lock onto her throat. Her inner wolf paced, claws unsheathed. I was checking the wind currents. The silver claws use scent-masking herbs. You can only find them if you're looking for the absence of smell, not the presence of it. But I wouldn't expect a blunt instrument like you to understand nuance, Malphus. She's defiant. She's dangerous, a council member yelled. Why is she not in the link color? Why is she standing beside the alpha as an equal? Because she is my equal, Cyprian said. The silence that followed was absolute. The statement was a political suicide note. In a pack hierarchy, no one was the alpha's equal, especially not a guide. Cyprian didn't care. The bond was humming between them, a golden vibration that told him Nyra was telling the truth and that Malphus was a walking corpse of lies. He could feel her pulse, steady, brave, yet laced with a growing, agonizing guilt that he couldn't quite decipher. "This is madness," Vane whispered, shaking his head. "Cyprian, you are compromised. The bond, we all smell it. You've let a fated mate cloud your judgment. You're putting the lives of thousands at risk for a woman who likely sold your head to the Silver Claws the moment she stepped through the gate." "Test her then," Cyprian challenged, his sightless gaze sweeping the room. "If you doubt her loyalty, put her to the trial of the silver tongue. But be warned, if she passes, I will take the tongue of the man who accused her." Before Vane could respond, the heavy iron chandelier above them groaned. To the others, it was just the building settling. To Cyprian, it was the sound of a structural pin being pulled. To Nyra, it was the sudden, sharp scent of friction-heated grease. "Cyprian, move!" Nyra didn't wait. She lunged, her body slamming into his chest with enough force to send them both sprawling across the basalt floor. A second later, 2 tons of wrought iron and candles crashed onto the exact spot where the alpha had been standing. The impact shattered the stone, sending shards of basalt flying like shrapnel.
The room plunged into chaos. Through the dust and smoke, 3 figures in black tactical gear dropped from the ventilation shafts. They didn't carry swords, they carried pneumatic dart guns. "Assassins!" Malthus roared, though he made no move to intercept them. Nyra rolled to her feet, her silver daggers flashing in the dim light. She didn't look back at Cyprian. She knew he was already moving. Despite his blindness, Cyprian was a whirlwind of controlled violence. He tracked the assassins by the displacement of air and the sound of their boots. He caught the first dart mid-air, spun, and jammed it into the neck of the nearest attacker. Nyra took the other 2. She moved with a feral, jagged grace, a blur of leather and steel. She kicked one assassin into the jagged wreckage of the chandelier and buried her dagger in the shoulder of the third, pinning him to the council table. "Who sent you?" she hissed, her knee pressed into the man's throat. The assassin didn't speak. He bit down on a cyanide capsule. His body went limp instantly. Nyra stood up, her chest heaving. She looked at the council. They were huddled against the walls, faces pale with terror, all except Vane and Malthus, who looked frustrated. She turned to Cyprian. He was standing by the wreckage, his blindfold slightly singed. He reached out into the empty air. Without a word, Nyra stepped into his reach. His hand found her cheek, his thumb brushing over a small cut on her jaw. "You're bleeding," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "It's not mine," she lied, her heart breaking. The trust in his touch was a physical weight. He wasn't just trusting her with his life, he was trusting her with his soul. And the guilt she'd been carrying, the secret mission she'd accepted from a rival pack months ago to find the Alpha's weakness, was now a serrated blade in her gut. She had come here to destroy him, but the bond had rewritten her very existence. "Alpha!" Vane stepped forward, his voice trembling with a new, sharper edge. "The assassins! Their gear! Look at the insignia!" Malthus pulled back the sleeve of the dead assassin on the table. A brand was seared into the flesh, the crest of the sun-washed veil. The room went cold. That was Nyra's home pack, the pack that had supposedly exiled her. "It seems," Malthus said, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face, "our guide didn't come here to serve. She came here as a Trojan horse. This wasn't an assassination attempt on the Alpha. It was a staged play to earn his trust." "That's a lie," Nyra shouted. "I haven't spoken to the Veil in years." "Then explain why you have a communication crystal from the Veil hidden in your boot." Malthus pointed to the floor where a small glowing shard had fallen during her scuffle with the assassins. Nyra stared at the crystal. She hadn't put it there. It was a plant, a perfect, undeniable frame-up. The council erupted. "Traitor! Execution! Strip her of her rank!" Cyprian's hand dropped from her face. His scent shifted, not to anger, but to a profound, hollow coldness that was far worse. "Nyra," he said, his voice a ghost of itself. "Tell me you didn't." "I didn't, Cyprian. I swear on the bond." "The bond can be faked by those clever enough," Vane shouted. "She's a sleeper agent. Alpha, if you do not arrest her now, we will declare you a traitor to the Peak alongside her." Cyprian stood tall, his jaw set. He was trapped. If he defended her, the pack would revolt and the Silverclaws would slaughter them all in the chaos. If he condemned her, he was murdering his own mate. "Take her to the high cells," Cyprian commanded, the words sounding like they were being ripped from his throat with pliers. As the enforcers dragged Nyra away, she didn't fight. She kept her eyes locked on Cyprian's blindfold, her heart screaming for him to hear the truth she couldn't speak. But as she was shoved through the doors, Malthus leaned in close to her ear, his voice a poisonous whisper. "It doesn't matter if you're innocent, little wolf. By dawn, the whole pack will know your real name, the one you used before the Veil exiled you, the one that ties you directly to the massacre of Cyprian's family 10 years ago." Nyra froze. Her blood turned to ice. "He doesn't know who you really are, does he?" Malthus chuckled.
The high cells of the Obsidian Peak were carved into the frozen marrow of the mountain, where the air was so thin it tasted like needles. Vespera, the name she had buried under years of grime and mercenary contracts, sat on the stone floor. Her hands were bound in silver wire that hummed with a low, agonizing frequency, suppressing her wolf. The heavy iron door groaned open. She didn't need eyes to know who it was. The scent of ozone and cedar preceded him. Cyprian stepped into the cell. He didn't have his guards. He didn't have his counsel. He only had the white silk blindfold and a posture that looked like it was holding up the weight of the sky. "Vespera," he said. The name hit her like a physical blow. She flinched, the silver wire biting into her wrists. "How long have you known?" "Since the moment you walked into the great hall," Cyprian said, his voice devoid of the rage she expected. It was hollow, echoing with a profound, ancient grief. "I don't need sight to recognize the daughter of the man who took mine. Your father's scent was a mix of ash and bitter almonds. Yours is the same, tempered by the rain." Vespera looked up, her amber eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I didn't choose him, Cyprian. I watched him do it. I was 10 years old. I tried to grab his arm when he raised the searing iron to your face, and he backhanded me across the room so hard I broke 3 ribs. I hated him more than you ever could. And yet, you came here." Cyprian stepped closer, the bond between them snapping and pulling, a golden thread frayed by a decade of blood. "The council says you're a sleeper agent. Malphus says you're the finishing blow your father couldn't deliver." "My father is dead. I killed him myself 3 years ago," Vespera screamed, her voice cracking. "I came here because the Veil offered me a clean slate if I tracked the blind king. But I didn't know it was you. I didn't know the boy I couldn't save had become the man I'm tethered to." Cyprian reached out. His hand trembled, a rare fracture in his obsidian mask. He touched the silver wire on her wrists. The silver burned his skin, hissing as it made contact, but he didn't pull away. With a surge of alpha strength, he snapped the wire like it was wet string. "They are waiting for me to execute you, Vespera. The pack is gathered in the courtyard. If I don't spill your blood, they will spill mine. Malphus has the Silver Claw war party waiting at the tree line. The moment I show weakness, the coup begins." "Then do it," she whispered, leaning her forehead against his chest. "Kill me. Save your pack. I'm a ghost anyway." Cyprian kilted her chin up. "I spent 10 years in the dark, learning how to rule a pack that wanted me dead. I didn't survive that just to watch the only light I've ever felt be extinguished by a bunch of cowards." The courtyard of the Obsidian Peak was a natural amphitheater of jagged stone, illuminated by massive bonfires that licked at the midnight sky. Thousands of wolves stood in the freezing wind, a sea of bared teeth and low growls. In the center stood a raised wooden platform, the executioner's block. Malphus stood by the block, a heavy silver axe resting against his shoulder. Beside him, Elder Vane watched the stairs with the predatory patience of a vulture. "The Alpha approaches," a herald cried. Cyprian emerged from the keep, his hand firmly on Vespera's shoulder. She was dressed in tattered leathers, her head bowed, playing the part of the condemned. The crowd erupted in a cacophony of insults. "Traitor! Slayer's brat! Kill the spy!" Cyprian led her onto the platform. He didn't stop at the block. He walked her to the very edge, overlooking the thousands of warriors. "Silence!" Cyprian's voice didn't just carry, it commanded. The alpha roar, a vocal frequency that forced lower-ranking wolves to their knees, rippled through the courtyard. The shouting died instantly. "You call for blood," Cyprian said, his sightless gaze sweeping the horizon. "You call for the death of the woman who saved your alpha from 3 assassins this morning. You call for the death of the only scout who has successfully tracked the Silver Claw movement in a month." "She is the daughter of the Butcher of the South," Malphus shouted, stepping forward. "She is the blood of the man who blinded you. To keep her is an insult to every wolf who died in that war." Cyprian turned toward Malphus. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. "You're right, Malphus. She is your blood, and according to our laws, the sins of the father are washed away by the service of the child." Cyprian reached up and did something no one expected. He untied the silk blindfold. For the first time in a decade, the pack saw his eyes. They weren't milky or scarred. They were a piercing, iridescent silver, clear as a winter moon. He wasn't blind in the traditional sense. His eyes had evolved to process the world through pure, raw energy. He saw the heat signatures of the crowd, the electrical pulses of their hearts, the shifting shadows of their lies. "I see you, Malphus," Cyprian hissed. "I see the silver claw coin in your pocket. I see the way your heart hammers with the rhythm of a traitor." The crowd gasped, a wave of shock rolling through the ranks. "Vespera is not my prisoner," Cyprian announced, his voice booming like thunder. He grabbed her hand and raised it high. "She is my consort. She is the High Luna of the Obsidian Peak, and any wolf who wishes to challenge her loyalty will have to crawl through my shadow to reach her." The silence was deafening. To claim a traitor as a mate in front of the entire pack was a move so bold, so arrogant, it momentarily paralyzed the opposition. Vespera looked at him, her heart shattering and reforming in a single second. She wasn't faking anymore. The guilt was gone, replaced by a fierce, burning devotion. She would burn the world down to keep this man on his throne. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. "So be it," Elder Vane said, his voice cold and thin. He raised a hand. "The Alpha has chosen a traitor over his people. By the laws of the first ancestors, he has forfeited the crown." From the dark woods surrounding the courtyard, a horn blasted, a deep, mournful sound that shook the earth. "The Silver Claws are here," someone screamed from the watchtower. But they weren't attacking the gates, they were already inside. The guards at the perimeter suddenly turned, their eyes glowing with a frenzied chemical red. They began slaughtering the wolves next to them. It wasn't a raid, it was a prearranged massacre. "Cyprian!" Vespera shouted, pulling her daggers. Malphus didn't go for Cyprian. He lunged at Vespera, his axe swinging in a lethal arc. If he wants a queen, let him rule over a corpse. Cyprian intercepted the axe with his bare hand, the silver edge slicing into his palm, but he didn't let go. He stared directly into Malphus's eyes. "You thought my blindness was my weakness," Cyprian growled, his silver eyes flashing with a blinding light. "But you forgot. I've spent 10 years learning to kill things I can't see. Imagine what I can do to the things I can." As the courtyard descended into a bloodbath, a second horn sounded from the north. Vespera's blood ran cold. She recognized that signal. It was her own pack, the sun-washed Vale, and they weren't here to rescue her. They were here to reclaim their property and finish what her father started. The coup was no longer just a pack struggle. It was a total war. "Cyprian!" Vespera leaned into his back as they were surrounded by traitors. "If we die tonight—" "We don't die," Cyprian said, his wolf beginning to shift, his bones popping and elongating. "We ascend." Behind them, the great keep began to rumble. The stone itself started to glow with the same silver light as Cyprian's eyes. The mountain was waking up.
The courtyard was no longer a place of judgment. It was a slaughterhouse. The air was thick with the copper tang of blood and the scorched hair smell of shifting wolves. The traitors, their eyes glowing with that chemically induced silver claw red, tore through the loyalists with a berserker fury. Cyprian stood back to back with Vespera on the executioner's platform. His silver eyes were wide, unblinking, tracking the invisible ley lines of the battle. He wasn't seeing flesh, he was seeing the bioelectric hum of every living thing in the square. "Left, 45 degrees,"
Vespera screamed, her daggers flashing as she hamstrung a traitor lunging from the shadows. 3 more coming from the armory arch. I have them, Cyprian wembled. He didn't turn. He reached behind his head, grabbed a discarded spear from the floor of the dais, and launched it. The wood whistled through the air, pinning 2 of the attackers to the stone wall before they could even draw breath. They're synchronized, Vespera panted, her heart hammering against her ribs, a rhythm Cyprian used to anger his own soul. The Silver Claws aren't just raiding, they're using a high-frequency whistle. Only the red eyes can hear it. It's how they're coordinating the pincer move. Cyprian tilted his head, filtering out the screams, the clashing steel, and the roar of the fires. There, at the edge of human hearing, a piercing, ultrasonic trill. The North Tower, Cyprian said. Vane is up there with a signal transmitter. He's the conductor of this massacre. We can't reach the tower, Vespera said, glancing at the sea of red-eyed wolves between them and the keep. There are too many. We don't go through them, Cyprian said, his voice dropping into that terrifying alpha register. We go over them. Vespera, do you trust me? I killed my past for you, Cyprian. Of course I trust you. Then be my eyes. Tell me the wind speed and the distance to the 3rd-story balcony. Vespera didn't hesitate. She glanced at the fluttering banners atop the keep. Wind is north-northwest, 10 knots. Distance is 40 feet. The masonry is old. Aim for the iron railing. Cyprian scooped her up in one arm, his muscles coiled, his bones humming with the power of a mountain that had finally woken up. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the peak, he leapt. For a heartbeat, they were weightless, suspended against the backdrop of a blood-red moon. Then, with a bone-jarring thud, Cyprian's free hand slammed into the iron railing of the balcony. The metal groaned, bending under his weight, but it held. He swung them both upward, landing silently on the stone terrace. Inside the North Tower, the air was cold and smelled of ozone. Elder Vane stood by a window, a small silver device in his hand, his face illuminated by the flickering light of the transmitter. Malphus stood beside him, wiping blood from his axe. The Alpha is dead or buried by now, Malphus said, his voice ragged. The Silver Claws will take the perimeter, and we will take the throne, as agreed. The blind king was a relic, Vane said, his voice devoid of emotion. A mutation that should have been pruned years ago. A relic? The voice came from the shadows of the doorway. Vane spun around, his heart rate spiking to 130. Cyprian heard it like a hammer on an anvil. Cyprian stepped into the light, Vespera at his side. He wasn't wearing the blindfold, and his silver eyes seemed to draw the very shadows of the room toward him. "You're vibrating, Vane," Cyprian said, walking forward with predatory slowness. "Your nervous system is screaming, traitor. I can hear the sweat breaking out on your palms. I can hear the gears of that little toy in your hand. Kill them!" Vane shrieked at Malphus. Malphus roared, charging with his axe, but he was fighting a man who no longer had to guess where the blow was coming from. Cyprian stepped inside the arc of the axe, his hand catching Malphus's throat. "Vespera," Cyprian said, his voice calm. "The transmitter." Vespera moved like a blur. Vane tried to throw the device out the window, but she intercepted him, catching his wrist and twisting it until the bone popped. He screamed, dropping the silver box. Vespera caught it midair and crushed it under her boot. The ultrasonic whistle stopped. Below, in the courtyard, the red-eyed wolves stumbled, suddenly deaf to their commands. The Loyalists, sensing the shift, redoubled their efforts. The tide was turning. Cyprian increased the pressure on Malphus's throat. The enforcer's face turned a bruised purple. "You told the pack she was a spy, but you were the one who invited the Veil into our woods. You were the one who promised my head in exchange for a seat at their table." "I did it for the pack," Malphus wheezed. "A blind alpha is an anchor." "I am the mountain,"
growled Cyprian, "and anchors are meant to keep the ship from drifting into the rocks. You, Malphus, are just the barnacle." With a sickening snap, Cyprian ended the enforcer's life and tossed the body aside like a piece of refuse. Vespera stood over the whimpering elder Vane, her dagger at his throat. She looked at Cyprian, really looked at him. The power radiating off him was intoxicating, a primal force that made her wolf want to howl in submission and pride. "What do we do with the architect?" she asked. "The pack decides his fate," Cyprian said, his silver eyes dimming slightly as the adrenaline began to ebb. "But first we finish the war. The sun-washed veil is still at the gates." "Cyprian," Vespera stepped toward him, her hand reaching for his. The bond flared, a warm golden anchor in the cold tower. "My brother," she said, "he's leading the Veil's vanguard. He won't stop until he sees you dead. He thinks I'm his inside woman." Cyprian took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. The bond flared, a warm golden anchor in the cold tower. "Then we give him a show he'll never forget. We operate as one. My strength, your sight. And our heart," she added.
They descended back to the courtyard, a duo of destruction. Every move was choreographed by the bond. When Cyprian swung, Vespera ducked. When Vespera threw a blade, Cyprian provided the distraction. They were no longer an alpha and a servant. They were a singular apex predator. The Silver Claw remnants were being pushed back toward the gates. The battle was almost won. Cyprian stood at the center of the carnage, his chest heaving. He looked toward the main gate, which was being battered from the outside. The heavy wood was splintering. "They're breaking through," Vespera warned, her eyes locked on the gate. "The Veil's heavy cavalry." "Let them come," Cyprian said. "I've spent 10 years preparing to defend this peak. I won't lose it now." Suddenly, a voice rang out from the battlements, a voice Cyprian recognized. It wasn't an enemy, it was Kalen, his younger brother and the captain of his personal guard, whom he had sent to the Southern Pass weeks ago. "Kalen, the Southern Pass is secure! We've returned!" Kalen shouted, leading a fresh troop of loyalists into the courtyard from the rear tunnels. Relief flooded Cyprian. Kalen was the only person he trusted implicitly, the man who had protected him during the dark years of his initial blindness. "Kalen," Cyprian called out, his guard dropping for the first time that night. "Secure the west flank. We're ending this now." Kalen ran toward them, his sword drawn, his face covered in the soot of battle. "I'm here, brother. I've got you." Kalen reached Cyprian, his scent familiar and comforting, cedar and old leather. Vespera, however, stiffened. Her nose flared. She didn't smell cedar. Underneath the familiar scent, there was a sharp hidden note, aconite, the smell of a wolf who had been taking a suppressant to hide their true intentions. "Cyprian, move!" she screamed, but it was too late. Kalen didn't go for the gates. He didn't go for the enemies. As he passed Cyprian, he swung his blade in a short, brutal arc, burying it deep in the Alpha's side, in the one spot not protected by his combat leathers. Cyprian gasped, his silver eyes wide with shock. He fell to one knee, the silver-coated blade sizzling in the wound. "Why?" Cyprian choked out, looking up at the brother he had loved. Kalen stood over him, his expression one of cold, clinical detachment. "Because Vane was right about one thing, Cyprian. A pack needs a king who can see the world. But you didn't just find your sight. You found a mate who makes you vulnerable. You would have burned this pack down for her." Kalen looked at Vespera, his lip curling. "And you, sister of my enemy, you're the perfect scapegoat." Kalen raised his sword for the killing blow as the gates of the Obsidian Peak finally burst open, admitting the army of the sun-washed Veil. Cyprian was down, bleeding silver, Vespera was surrounded, and the brother he had trusted was the one holding the knife.
The silver-coated blade in Cyprian's side didn't just cut flesh, it burned into his very essence. The Alpha collapsed to one knee, the stone of the courtyard cold against his palm. His silver eyes, once brilliant with the light of the mountain, flickered and dimmed like a dying star. Kaelin. The name was a choked rasp. "Don't look so surprised, brother," Kaelin said, his voice devoid of the warmth that had defined their childhood. He stood over Cyprian, the moonlight catching the crimson slick on his sword. "You were always too poetic for leadership. You turned your blindness into a myth, but you forgot that a myth can be shattered by a single inch of steel." Around them, the perimeter had buckled. The sun-washed Vale's heavy cavalry surged through the shattered gates, their golden banners clashing with the soot and blood of the Obsidian Peak. Leading them was a man with a jagged scar across his nose, Torin, Vespera's brother. "Vespera!" Torin roared, his horse skidding to a halt near the executioner's platform. "Step away from the mongrel. You've done your job. The king is on his knees. The peak is ours." Vespera stood frozen between the two men. To her left, the brother who shared her blood, offering her a return to the only home she had ever known, a life without the exile brand on her shoulder. To her right, the man who had seen through her lies and claimed her soul, currently bleeding out in the dirt. The alpha trauma flared in her chest, that old, cold whisper that told her all alphas were the same, that she was just a tool to be passed from one hand to another. "She's not your tool, Torin," Kaelin said, eyeing the Vale commander. "She's the scapegoat. Once the peak is liberated, she'll be executed for the assassination of her own mate. It's a clean narrative. The people will want stability, and I will be the one to provide it." Cyprian coughed, silver-tainted blood splattering the snow. "Vespera! Run!" Even now, dying and betrayed, his first instinct was her safety. The bond between them, frayed by the silver in his veins, let out a final, agonizing pulse. It wasn't a command, it was a plea of pure, unadulterated love. Vespera looked at Kaelin's cold ambition. She looked at Torin's arrogant greed. Then she looked at the blind king who had trusted her with the secret of his eyes. The choice wasn't between packs, it was between being a weapon or being a partner. "I'm not a scout anymore, Torin," Vespera said, her voice dropping into a low, terrifying growl. She reached into her boots and pulled out two long, curved daggers, blades she had forged herself in the scrapyards. "And I'm definitely not your scapegoat, Kaelin." She stepped over Cyprian's kneeling form, shielding him with her body. "You chose the wrong side of history, boys," she hissed. "Kill them both," Kaelin barked.
The sun-washed Vale warriors lunged. Vespera didn't wait for them. She became a whirlwind of vengeance. She moved with a speed that defied the suppression of the silver mist in the air, her daggers carving a path of ruin through the first wave of attackers. But there were too many. A mace caught her in the ribs, sending her spinning across the stone. She tasted copper. Her vision blurred. "Cyprian," she whispered, her hand reaching back toward him. I can't hold them all." Cyprian felt her pain through the bond. It acted like a defibrillator to his failing heart. The silver poison was agonizing, but the thought of Vespera falling was worse. He reached deep into the core of the mountain, down into the ancient geothermal power that only the true alpha of the peak could access. The ground began to vibrate. Not a tremor, but a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that matched Cyprian's heartbeat. "The mountain," Vane whispered from the shadows of the tower, his eyes wide with terror. "He's waking the earth blood." Cyprian gripped the hilt of the sword in his side. With a guttural scream of pure agony and defiance, he ripped the silver blade from his own flesh.
The wound smoked, the silver vaporizing as his internal temperature skyrocketed. He stood up. His silver eyes weren't just glowing now, they were emitting beams of pure white radiance that cut through the smoke of the courtyard. "Kaelin," Cyprian said, his voice sounding like grinding tectonic plates. "Let me show you why relics are feared." Cyprian slammed his fist into the stone floor. A shockwave of kinetic energy erupted from the point of impact. The stone beneath the feet of the Vale cavalry shattered, sending horses and riders flying. The traitors who had sided with Kaelin were thrown back by a localized gravity surge, pinned to the walls of the keep by the sheer weight of the Alpha's will. Vespera scrambled to her feet, sensing the shift. She didn't need to be told what to do. She saw the opening. "Torin is mine!" she shouted. She lunged at her brother. Torin swung his broadsword, but Vespera was no longer fighting as an individual. She was the eyes of the mountain. She saw the minute twitch in his shoulder before he swung. She stepped inside his guard, her dagger finding the gap in his armor under his arm. Torin gasped, dropping his sword. He looked at his sister with a mix of shock and fading rage. "You traitor!" "No," Vespera whispered in his ear as she twisted the blade. "I'm a queen." She let him fall and turned back to the center of the courtyard. Cyprian had Kaelin by the throat. The younger brother was kicking, his face a mask of terror as he looked into the silver suns of Cyprian's eyes. "I loved you, Kaelin," Cyprian said, the heat radiating off his skin, singeing Kaelin's collar. "I would have given you everything, but you tried to take her." "Please," Kaelin wheezed. Cyprian didn't kill him, not yet. He turned his head, sensing the remaining warriors, both loyalist and traitor, frozen in awe and fear. The battle had stopped. The presence of the Alpha was too heavy to ignore. "The veil is broken," Cyprian's voice echoed off the peaks. "The traitors are exposed. Any wolf who still holds a blade against the High Luna will be buried by the very stone they stand on." One by one, the weapons hit the floor. The rebellion had been cauterized by the sheer force of the mate bond and the Alpha's evolution. Vespera walked toward Cyprian. Her leathers were shredded, her face smeared with blood and soot, but she had never looked more regal. She placed a hand on his arm, the arm still holding Kaelin aloft. "Don't let the darkness take you, Cyprian," she said softly. "The pack needs a king, not a monster." The silver light in his eyes softened. The intense heat faded, leaving only the steady, warm glow of the bond. He dropped Kaelin, who collapsed into a heap of sobbing cowardice. Cyprian leaned against Vespera, his strength finally spent. The wound in his side was closing, but the emotional scar of his brother's betrayal was fresh and deep. "Is it over?" Cyprian asked, his voice returning to its melodic rumble. "The fighting is," Vespera said, looking at the survivors. "But the judgment is just beginning. We have a pack to rebuild, and a lot of traitors to execute." "Not just the pack," Cyprian said, turning his head toward the north. His silver eyes caught a new heat signature, something massive, something ancient, moving through the deep snow of the higher ridges. It wasn't a wolf. It was something far larger, its heart beating with the slow, rhythmic thud of a drum. "What is it?" Vespera asked, sensing his sudden tension. "The silver claws were just the distraction," Cyprian whispered. "The real threat, the god that your father summoned to blind me 10 years ago, is coming to finish the job." A low, guttural roar echoed from the mountain peaks, a sound that made even the bravest warriors whimper. The clouds above the Obsidian Peak began to swirl into a dark, unnatural vortex. Cyprian reached for his blindfold, not to hide his eyes, but to tie his and Vespera's wrists together in a symbolic knot of the fated mate bond. "The Ancient One is here," Cyprian said, drawing his sword once more. The heavy doors of the great hall burst open as a shadow larger than the keep itself fell over the courtyard. The final confrontation hadn't just begun. It had evolved into a fight for the survival of the entire species.
The shadow that fell over the Obsidian Peak was not made of clouds. It was a living vacuum, a towering monstrosity of matted fur and ancient, festering malice. The Fenris White, the primordial progenitor of their curse, had breached the veil of the high ridges. This was the entity that had stolen Cyprian's sight 10 years ago, a creature that fed on the sensory light of alphas. The pack screamed. Warriors who had faced silver and steel without flinching now scrambled backward, their primal instincts overriding their training. Even the sun-washed Vale's invaders dropped their banners, paralyzed by the sight of a nightmare made flesh. "It's a god," Kalen whimpered from the dirt, his betrayal forgotten in the face of annihilation. "We can't kill a god." Cyprian stood in the center of the chaos, his silver eyes fixed on the towering void. He felt the creature's hunger, a cold, psychic drain that sought to pull the very electricity from his nerves. "Vespera," Cyprian's voice was a low, steady anchor in the storm. "I'm here," she said, stepping to his side. She didn't look at the monster with fear. She looked at it with the calculated coldness of a woman who had survived the scrapyards. She took the silk blindfold from his hand and began to wrap it around their joined wrists, binding them together at the bone. "They think I'm blind," Cyprian whispered, his silver eyes beginning to pulse with a rhythmic subterranean light. "But they don't understand. To see with eyes is to be deceived by the surface. To see with the mountain is to know the truth of every atom." "Show them," commanded Vespera. "Show them why you are the king." The Fenris White let out a roar that shattered every window in the great keep. It lunged, its massive shadow claws sweeping toward the executioner's platform to snuff out the Alpha's light once and for all. Cyprian didn't move. He closed his eyes. In the total darkness of his mind, the world transformed. The screaming wolves became heat signatures of pulsing orange. The stone of the courtyard became a grid of blue vibrations. And the white, the great, terrifying shadow, was nothing more than a chaotic swirl of black noise. "Left 10 degrees, Vespera whispered, her voice transmitted directly through the bond into his soul. "It's overextending. Its heart is shielded by a plate of ancient bone." Cyprian moved. He wasn't a man fighting a monster. He was a dancer moving to the frequency of the universe. He stepped inside the white sweep, the massive claws whistling inches above his head. He lunged forward, his sword now glowing with the white-hot intensity of the earth blood, cutting through the shadow flesh like a hot needle through silk. The creature shrieked, a sound of static and agony. "Now," Cyprian roared. Vespera launched herself off his shoulder, using the momentum of his strike. She didn't have his supernatural strength, but she had his focus. Through the bond, she saw what he saw, the noise of the creature's armor. She found the single microscopic fracture in the bone plate over its chest. She slammed her silver dagger into the crack. The white buckled. The darkness began to bleed out of it, evaporating into the freezing mountain air. But the creature wasn't done. In a final desperate act of spite, it released a pulse of pure sensory deprivation, a blackout designed to blind every living thing in the courtyard. A wave of absolute darkness swept over the peak. The torches died. The moon disappeared. The pack fell to the ground, clutching their eyes, trapped in a void so thick it felt like drowning. "I can't see," Kalen screamed. "My eyes," Torin wailed. The entire pack was helpless, stumbling in the dark as the white prepared for a final crushing blow. Except for one man. Cyprian stood tall, his posture relaxed, his sight unaffected by the lack of light.
He turned his head toward the invisible monster. "You took my eyes 10 years ago to make me weak, but all you did was teach me to rule in the dark. In this void, I am the only one who truly sees." He didn't need Vespera to guide him now. He was the guide. He pulled her close, her body trembling in the sudden blindness. "Trust me," he whispered. He swung his sword in a perfect 360-degree arc. The blade wasn't cutting flesh, it was cutting the concept of the darkness. The earth-blood power surged through the steel, a blinding silver supernova that erupted from the center of the courtyard. The light didn't just return, it exploded. The Fenris white disintegrated, shattered into a million shards of harmless ash by the purity of the Alpha's light. The blackout was lifted, and the pack blinked, their vision returning to see their Alpha standing over the remains of a god.
The silence that followed was absolute. Cyprian stood at the edge of the platform, the silk blindfold still tied to his and Vespera's wrists. He looked out over the thousands of wolves, the loyalists, the traitors, and the invaders. "Look at me," Cyprian commanded. Every wolf in the courtyard, from the lowliest Omega to the highest commander, dropped to their knees. It wasn't the alpha roar forcing them down this time. It was the sheer, undeniable weight of his sovereignty. "You doubted me because I could not see the borders of our land," Cyprian said, his silver eyes scanning the front ranks. "But I saw the rot in our council. I saw the greed in my own brother's heart. I saw the soul of a woman who was sent to kill me and chose to save us all instead." He turned to Vane and Kaelin, who were being held by loyalist guards. "Elder Vane," Cyprian said, "you sought to leash me to a guide so you could pull the strings. You traded the lives of your kin for a shadow throne." Vane tried to speak, but no sound came out. "Malphus is dead. Kaelin, my brother, you will be stripped of your rank and cast into the scrapyard you once mocked. You will live the life Vespera lived, and we will see if you have the strength to survive it." Kaelin was dragged away, weeping, his transition from prince to pariah complete. Finally, Cyprian turned to Torin and the sun-washed Veil warriors. "And you," Cyprian growled, "you came for our land. You used your sister as a pawn in a game you weren't smart enough to win. Your pack is now a vassal of the Obsidian Peak. You will pay tribute in silver and grain for 50 years, or I will personally walk into your vale and show you how a blind king hunts." Torin bowed his head, the weight of his defeat absolute.
Cyprian turned to Vespera. The sun was beginning to peek over the jagged peaks of the north, the first light of a new era hitting her face. She looked exhausted, bloodied, and more beautiful than any legend. He reached out and untied the silk bond from their wrists. He didn't put it back over his eyes. He tossed the silk into the dying embers of the bonfire. "The Obsidian Peak has survived the night," Cyprian announced to the pack. "But we did not survive because of me alone." He took Vespera's hand and led her to the very center of the throne dais. "Many of you know her as the daughter of our enemy. Many of you know her as a rebel. But from this breath forward, you will know her as the Luna of the North." A few elders moved to protest, but one look from Cyprian's silver eyes silenced them forever. "She is my eyes, my blade, and my soul," Cyprian said, his voice softening as he looked at her. "She does not stand behind me. She does not stand beneath me. She stands with me. Those who assigned her to me wanted me to suffer under her rebellious spirit. They connived to use her for my downfall, but fate had other plans," he added. Vespera felt the bond snap into its final, permanent shape, a bridge of golden light that would never break. The trauma of her past, the memories of her father's cruelty, and the fear of being a tool were washed away by the absolute devotion in Cyprian's gaze. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. I know, he smiled. I can hear your heart. It's finally beating for yourself. Cyprian turned back to the pack, his chest expanding as he let out a roar that echoed through the valleys, reaching the ears of every rival pack in the north. It was a warning. It was a promise. The blind king had found his queen, and together they saw a future that no one else dared to imagine. Cyprian leaned into Vespera's ear, his voice a dangerous, triumphant velvet. They thought they could steal my vision, he whispered, but they didn't realize that in the dark I finally found the only thing worth looking at. Vespera smiled, her amber eyes glowing as she looked out over their kingdom. Then let's give them something to watch. She reached over and obsessively kissed him. He held her firmly, never wanting to let her go. The pack erupted into a deafening howl of acceptance, a thunderous sound that shook the very foundations of the mountain. The war was over. The reign of the Obsidian Peak had truly begun. The darkness had tried to swallow the king, but it had only succeeded in giving him a throne made of stars.